Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ghoul Guides Association. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And we are the Ghoul Guides. And this is a show where we just talk about things Gothic. So this is still quite new. We're still getting used to it. But the idea of the Ghoul Guides Association is that we pick a topic, something that is related to the Gothic or something that gets neglected but is very Gothic, and we tell each other about it. We talk about the history, why it's important, why it's Gothic. Eventually I will come up with a more succinct introduction for this show, but while we are getting used to it, this is what you're getting, so deal with it, guys. So this is another episode of the Ghoul Guides Association, and today Dr. Mary Going, the newly minted, will be taking control, and I believe this is going to be a multiple parter, so buckle up, you guys.
Yes, so before I reveal the topic of the episode, I just want to say, Lauren, do you remember way back when we were having this idea of different shows that we could do, and I was like, oh, I really love this one band and I really want to do an episode on this one band. And if anyone knows Lauren and I, we have slightly different music tastes. Sometimes they overlap. Lauren's is definitely more eclectic and varied. You like a wide variety of music. Yeah.
It's true.
and at some point I'm looking forward to delving into your music tastes and why some of the artists that you like are Gothic. But for me, I I tend to just like stuff with guitars.
I feel like you are like a canonical, you like stuff that is, that goes hand in hand with the specialism that we have and the research that we do. And the Venn diagram of Lauren and Mary, there is quite a shared middle section that is mostly sort of 2004 to 2008 kind of emo, screamo, hardcore, but yeah, your music taste, I mean, I still think your music taste is very eclectic, because within the genres that you like a lot of really interesting bands. But yeah, I think you have the credentials. I kind of am sometimes a bit people are like, hey, what did you do? And I'm like, I went to see Taylor Swift.
which is totally fine. That's a legitimate thing to do.
So yeah, but I think because we've talked about this, I know what you're going to talk about today. I don't know much about it, so I am excited, but I think this is going to be a really interesting series, because I think this is going to be one of those things that people go, of course this is Gothic, of course this is connected to the Gothic, but actually I don't know if we all think about how and where it comes from and why it's so culturally significant. So I'm looking forward to you talking about this.
Oh, excellent. So yeah, my music taste is basically just very heavy. So today's episode is going to be a Gothic history of heavy metal, part one. Because obviously if I'm doing a history of an entire musical genre, it's way too big to fit into one episode. But we're gonna dive into some of the origins today, and then some of the kind of early Gothic underpinnings.
And I like that, underpinning. Yeah, that's a great word.
And I think as well, what's really interesting is so obviously adjacent to this, you have goth music, which sometimes has a little overlap with metal, but I've never really been into goth music, the Cure or Bauhaus and stuff. And I think a lot of people, when you think of what would a Gothic academic listen to, people think goth music, oh yeah, all of that kind of Cure stuff and
well, yeah,
and
there's very much that I always think of, even though it's very pop, the New Romantics, that very kind of 80s, the white blouses and makeup, and the Cure and Bauhaus obviously kind of interlinked to that, and they're kind of all part of a similar scene, but not the same thing.
Yeah, and if you are a fan of goth music, then I do have to apologize, then this episode is not going to talk about that at all. We're just going to talk about heavy metal, but hopefully you'll stick around and maybe find some new bands that you might want to check out. So to start with, just to kind of acknowledge that it is always hard to pinpoint like exactly when like new like music genres or film trends or like generic modes in fiction originate. Everything has to begin somewhere, but it's always a little bit fuzzy, isn't it? Like,
yes, and often things start at the same time in multiple different places.
Exactly. So like I guess with Gothic, we've all kind of decided that we can say Gothic starts with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, but there's lots of stuff like before that book came out that we can now look at and see, well, this is Gothic. So I think I'm just going to take that kind of approach and be like, yes, there are obviously like stuff that comes before and around the same time, but I'm going to have a kind of fuzzy definitive origin kind of band. And also part of that is that it appropriates and cultivates existing things, which again is something that Horace Walpole did with The Castle of Otranto, where he took a lot of things from different places. So yeah, like heavy metal obviously draws on like rock and roll, psychedelic rock, and the blues. And here, just to kind of shout out to our episode on Crossroads, we do talk about the blues. So if you're interested in learning about why the blues is Gothic, then go and check that out.
Yeah, go check out this episode.
Yeah, and maybe we'll put a link somewhere in the YouTube video.
Oh yeah. Check out the link below.
Check out the link
that future Lauren and future Mary have definitely put in the episode description.
But for now, let's dive into heavy metal. So, in Birmingham, England, in 1968, guitarist Tony Iommi, drummer Bill Ward, bassist Geezer Butler, and vocalist Ozzy Osbourne formed the band Black Sabbath.
Hey.
So 2 years later, in 1970, they released their first single, Evil, followed by their self-titled debut album. And what set this band apart from like other bands in the 60s and then in the 70s is their dark and at times ominous musical sound, and also their occult lyrical content and aesthetics. So Lauren, I know you've said not as well versed as metal as I am, but if I say to you Black Sabbath, what comes to mind? Like what immediately comes to mind?
The fantastic mid-2000s show The Osbournes. No, I think of like Crazy Train, Ozzy Osbourne eating a bat, like Tony Iommi being, so I used to play guitar, and Tony Iommi was always the like sort of lots of people's icon, like that was who a lot of people were like aspiring to be. And I do think even obviously metal is a global genre, but I think being British in particular, because they come from Birmingham and because they're like an institution, there's also that kind of like cultural awareness. But yeah, I think mostly when I think Black Sabbath, I think pentagrams, biting the heads off bats, and the song Crazy Train. I don't know, is that what the song is called, or is that just the like refrain?
Yeah. So obviously Black Sabbath has a kind of interesting history, especially their relationship with their singers. So Ozzy is the first singer. They also then got James Dio when they kicked Ozzy out. And then Ozzy has gone on to have like a really, really like good solo career. So quite a lot of the songs that you named, including Crazy Train, they're all like Ozzy songs.
Yes.
And he owes a lot of his career to Sharon Osbourne. She was an amazing manager.
I have to just say is why she is on X Factor, and I don't think anybody understood that at the time.
Yeah, no, 100%. She I think she managed Black Sabbath a little bit, but then when Ozzy left, she became his manager, and like together you can just see that the Osbourne show is because of Ozzy's solo career, but obviously it's not solo career because Sharon was managing him, and he had like an array of like amazing like musicians behind him as well. But to go back to Black Sabbath, which is kind of where he kind of got his name from, like they are a kind of similar aesthetic, and yes, like all that kind of like occult stuff and the pentagrams, that's definitely like what they started to bring in, and we are definitely going to come back to how important it is that they come from Birmingham in the UK. So before,
I was just going to say, it's just occurred to me, I never realised until you just said it, like 1968, 1970, this is like completely concurrent to Anton LaVey then, isn't it? Like this is all happening at the same time as the Church of Satan.
Yeah.
Becoming a thing. I never, like, obviously, and I've always thought of like Black Sabbath as being kind of using that same imagery as like kind of, you know, the beginnings of Satanism and things like that, but it's never clicked in my head that actually these two things are happening sort of at the same time.
It's a counterculture, you know, and it is similar again to kind of goth subculture as a being kind of counter to the mainstream, but yeah, like all of these things, and as we'll get into, like, you know, horror becoming more, you know, I don't know, mainstream is the wrong word, but, you know, just available and visible, and accessible. Yeah, exactly.
There's two types of counterculture, let's be honest. There's accessible counterculture, and then there's counterculture that you only get if you know the person that can take you down the back alley and knock on the right door.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, I always think that's really interesting with metal, especially because I think when people think of, like, especially kind of more gothic countercultures, again, like people think about goth, but there's lots of gothic that you can find in other kinds of places like metal and also punk, and all of those kinds of things. But did you know that they weren't always called Black Sabbath?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they had like a couple of different names, and at one stage quite early on they went by the name Earth.
Oh, interesting.
But there was another band called Earth at the time, so they were kind of like thinking, well, we need to like find another name, and how they found the name like Black Sabbath is really interesting. So basically they had this rehearsal space where they would go and rehearse their songs, and get high and all that kind of stuff, and across the road from this rehearsal space was a cinema. And one day Geezer Butler noticed that this cinema was screening the 1963 horror film Black Sabbath, which obviously starred the horror icon Boris Karloff.
Yep.
And he saw, like, you know, how so many people were just basically lining up to go and see this film, and he thought that it was strange that so many people were spending all this money to go and see scary films, but then obviously had the idea, well, why don't we do something similar? So they wanted to capitalize on that trend. So first of all, they wrote the song Black Sabbath, which again also still draws on horror stuff. So this song draws on the works of horror author Dennis Wheatley, but it also, as a lot of things, and again I'm thinking, you know, Horace Walpole's Otranto, it has a very gothic genesis, because Butler basically had a vision or a dream of this kind of black silhouetted figure that was standing at the foot of his bed. So if you think about how important like dreams and things like that are in Gothic, and especially in that creative process, authors will have these kinds of experiences or dreams, and then they'll work that into their stories. And that's exactly what they did with this song Black Sabbath. So I'm not gonna attempt to like recreate the musical melody of this song. I'm just gonna read you some of the lyrics.
Oh, Mary, sing it.
Because
I wish to be entertained.
I would absolutely not do as well a job at this as Ozzy. So just kind of, as you listen to these lyrics, just, I don't know, pretend that Ozzy's singing them, or go and listen to the song Black Sabbath, and because I think as well as the lyrics, pause and go and listen to the song Black Sabbath,
go and listen to the song, come back,
and you can get a real like kind of sense of like the eerie kind of like ominous atmosphere as well. But anyway, so with that, thinking about that, and the fact that like Butler had this vision of this black silhouetted figure, so it says, what is this that stands before me? Figure in black which points at me. Turn round quick and start to run. Find out I'm the chosen one. Big black shape with eyes of fire, telling people their desire. Satan sitting there, he's smiling. watches those flames get higher and higher. Oh no, please, God, help me. So, I mean, quite spooky, even just with me reading it out. And hopefully if you have gone and listened to it, you can hear how ominous it sounds. And like musically, they use quite a lot what's called the tritone, which is also known as the devil's interval. So you have like, you know, Ozzy is like haunting and demonic singing, and this like weird like devilish music, and that basically created their kind of Gothic sound. And on, you know, partly due to the success of this song, they decided to change their name to Black Sabbath and continue making like similar music. So you can go and check out, I mean, some of their videos as well, especially like, which I haven't really made any notes on, but if you go and look at some of their like, especially from their like early albums, their music videos are really creepy and satanic and occult. And it's just creepy. I could go on talking about Black Sabbath for a long time.
Everybody loves something slightly disturbing. I feel like these are the music videos I remember as a kid, like when you would watch like VH1. For those of you too young to remember music channels, VH1 was like the slightly more established, like MTV was Young and Cool. And then VH1 was like the one that, you know, your dad listened to and watched. And often they would have like music videos from like the 80s, 70s and 80s and stuff. And some of them were really upsetting. I remember some of them like really like disturbing me and being like, wait, what? That was just 2 minutes of creepy. What happened? I need resolution.
Some of them are really creepy. And especially because a lot of Black Sabbath songs are, I guess, fairly slow. They've got that whole kind of like slow creeping, like ominous, eerie guy. And Ozzy, like the reason why one of the reasons why he's so successful now, both in Black Sabbath but also as a solo artist, is because his voice is very unique and creepy.
And he could sing like a lot of, I think, because we've come to this, you know, we're born. Well, I'm like 89, you're early 90s. Like, we were born in the 90s. We grew up in the 90s. We are used to people like Ozzy as like older dudes. Like, you know, like my picture of Ozzy Osbourne is very much from the show The Osbournes. And he could still sing, but he didn't have, you know, he wasn't as like, you know, good as he was. And you don't always realize how good these people were in their prime. Also, because we're like the children of like the emo period where a lot of people couldn't sing.
Well, a lot of people thought they could sing.
Yes, and either could sing. There was no in between, was there? People could either sing really, really well or couldn't sing at all. But he genuinely was like a really talented vocalist in his prime.
And he's still going. He's got a single out now. I mean, he's just been in hospital. And he's written a song about, I think it's called Patient Number 9 or something. He's still going. So yeah, like I like Ozzy, and you know, I say good on him. There's a lot of bands that we're going to talk about that actually are still making music, and I just find it really interesting. But we are I guess we're focusing on like the kind of Gothic origins. But okay, so moving away from Black Sabbath, there's one other band that I want to talk to that's like talk to you about that's really important to the kind of like Gothic origins of heavy metal.
Okay.
So I just want to see, do you have any idea what band I could be talking about?
I have like inklings, but my issue is that I don't know when anybody debuted.
Yeah.
So I know in my head, I'm like, oh, these are bands that I would think of as being, you know, like the dons of heavy metal, or like the, you know, the people that really like set the tone and set the genre. I have absolutely no idea when anybody started. Like I have no idea, because like they were, you know, when we were teenagers and like learning to play guitar and stuff, they were just all the established greats, and I have no idea how long anyone had been around when they started making music.
That was a little That was a little bit of a unfair question. I apologize.
Yeah, I have no. So in the answer to the question, Mary, is there's about 20 bands I could think of, but also I have absolutely no idea.
Okay, so to put you out of your misery, we're going to talk about Judas Priest.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you know when Judas Priest formed?
No, I have no idea. If I took it, see, in my head, everyone's the 80s, but I know that that's not true.
1969.
No way.
So a year after Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
And so their frontman Rob Halford joined in 1973. So they are definitely like a kind of 70s band. But I do think that it's interesting that like you have like these two bands forming
around the same time.
Around the same time. Do you know where Judas Priest come from?
No.
Birmingham, UK.
Birmingham, man.
Yeah.
Up the Brum.
So again, like, and I will get to this in a minute, but like Birmingham and the kind of city and the place that Birmingham is really important to like the formation of heavy metal, and also I think what adds to its kind of gothicness. But yeah, so Rob Halford joins a few years after, and he brings with him massive, powerful operatic vocals. If you've listened to any Judas Priest song, like they're so difficult to sing along to because his range and the power behind his voice is just so amazing. He also brought a hell of a lot of camp.
Yes. Judas Priest are so camp.
They're so camp. So you have this front man who has like this powerful operatic voice and he's very camp, and then you also have like musically they have like this kind of distinctive double guitar sort of sound. And talking about Black Sabbath song, Black Sabbath, which we just talked about, Rob Halford said that song is probably the most evil song ever written, which I think is one of the highest compliments that you can give when your own band has songs like A Touch of Evil, Hell Patrol, and Necromancer. So they are a very different band to Black Sabbath, and you know we talked about how Black Sabbath, a lot of their songs are slow and creepy. A lot of Judas Priest songs are really, really fast, but they're still kind of bringing in that kind of occult and satanic lyrics and aesthetics, and also like their visuals and their vocals and their guitars. It's all that kind of like what we would call gothic excess. It's just so extra.
Judas Priest have such a specific, like, if you are like watching or listening and you don't know Judas Priest, Google them, because they have such a specific aesthetic that has been so instrumental in shaping that perception, don't they? So
I just want to quickly say this. What my favorite thing about Judas Priest is that they are just undeniably camp, and you might look back and think, how did people at the time not realize that they were camp? But basically Halford, so Rob Halford, the front man, is gay, but he didn't come out until 1998. So we're talking about a band that I mean, they're still touring now, but really in their prime in the 70s and the 80s. But throughout all of that time, nobody, even his bandmates, didn't really know. But he consciously worked into the band's look and aesthetic, leather and spikes and motorcycles. So these are all associated with, I guess, a working class alternative look. So we've talked about kind of like subcultures and countercultures that are different to the mainstream. But they also come from the kink and leather scene. And I think that's what Rob was doing. He was kind of putting all the stuff that he loved that does come from this kind of gay scene into heavy metal.
Oh God, there's an artist that is, I think, from around about the 80s, really famous for these illustrations of what we would probably call like beefcake, that were very much like heavily working class. So it was always like beefy guys in like denim, in like overalls, in leather, and it was that, like, on the one hand super hyper masculine, like there would often be muscle cars and things like that, but also like leather, and like, so on the one hand so camp and like so obviously homoerotic, but super, super hyper masculine, and people didn't realize that this was counterculture and this was queer because it was so hyper masculine. And I cannot remember what the name of the artist is. If I remember, I will look it up and I'll put it in the notes. But I think like, this is me assuming, but there must have been a connection between those two things, because like the aesthetic of Judas Priest and the aesthetic of that artist, and it was such a huge thing in like queer culture and subculture. And I know for a fact, and William Hughes has talked about this, that it had a huge impact on like 80s queer Gothic.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's exactly what Judas Priest is drawing on. And I think the rest, we can say this comes from Rob Halford. I think the other guys in the band didn't really know that he was gay, and they just really liked the aesthetic because they thought it looked cool and like, yes, very manly, and like, yes, it is very manly, but in
very masculine,
very homoerotic way. And I'm forgetting the title of the film, but there's a new film on Netflix that's about heavy metal, and it's like a school kind of like film where it ends up being like a battle of the bands, and it has one of the kids from It starring in it.
Okay.
But basically there's a bit in it where they're in their basement, and the girl, there's a girl that plays one of the instruments, it's just like, heavy metal's really gay, and they just have like a cut to all of the posters that are on the wall, and they're just of men in all of these like denim and leather, and it's like, yeah, like, and I think this is really important, because I think Gothic and Gothic spaces and things that are influenced by Gothic are always in that kind of area of counterculture or going against the mainstream, where people or identities that are othered are always welcome, and even if you don't think consciously that they are, and they're always there and they're always present. And I think Judas Priest is such a good band to look at for that, because they're so undeniably camp and queer, and also so metal and so manly, and I mean that in all the kind of like ways of that word.
Well, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that one of the YMCA, is it them called Men at Work? I can't remember what the actual band are, but obviously their like costumes are all supposed to be these like iconic queer kind of like stereotypes, and I'm pretty sure one of them is based on Halford. Like one of them is supposed to be like Judas Priest, so it's not like people weren't picking up on this, but it is so interesting to think like, yeah, actually loads of people didn't realize, and it was influencing pop as well. I mean, when you look at 80s pop, like this is 70s heavy metal, like look at George Michael, look at like the way that people were embracing
exactly,
like it was having such a huge impact.
George Michael's another really good example though, because so many people didn't know that he was gay. And I mean, again, you look back at Wham and you're like, how did people not know? But I think it's just that especially in the 70s and the 80s, this kind of stuff was seen by people outside of those communities as just being very fun or manly.
Fun.
and it is, but just in a slightly different way. But yeah, so Judas Priest is undeniably hell-bent for leather, which is another one of their songs. And I want to have another look at one of their songs, and look at the homoerotic narrative in their song "A Touch of Evil," because I think we can see the kind of the homoerotic balanced with the satanic and the occult. So now would be another time, if you want to go and listen to the actual song rather than me just reading lyrics, pause here and go and listen to Judas Priest, "A Touch of Evil," and then come back. Because I'm not going to try and replicate Rob Halford's powerful operatic voice. I'm just going to read the lyrics. So go and do that if you want to. If not, I'm just going to read the lyrics for you.
Future Lauren and Future Mary will put the links maybe.
They'll be somewhere. But okay, so this is some of the lyrics from "A Touch of Evil." Arousing me now with a sense of desire, possessing my soul till my body's on fire. A dark angel of sin, praying deep from within. Come take me in, you're possessing me. In the night, come to me. You know I want your touch of evil. In the night, please set me free. I can't resist a touch of evil.
Dante Gabriel Rossetti wishes.
Oh yeah, so I think so you have basically this really gothic narrative of Satan and sin to describe homoerotic desire, but what it's doing is it's subverting those tropes to make them undeniably sexy and sensual. Like I deny you to listen to that song and not think that, wow, this is like orgasmic, or like this is basically a song about sexual desire. And it's very, again, so it's matched with the kind of the gothic excess of Halford's amazing voice and the guitars, and it really takes you to some heights. And
but kind of like re-embodying the idea of the demon lover as well.
100%.
You know, really popular poetic convention, particularly post-Napoleonic, of I mean, it happens in poetry and prose, but there was this real popular trend of, you know, imagining these demonic, otherworldly, devilish, preternatural, supernatural, or slightly, you know, often human, but with a touch of something, lovers, and the experience of desire for these lovers. And this is kind of picking that up and putting it to music in a way that reinterprets it, but also is almost exactly the same. Like it's the same vibe.
Yeah, like 100%. And the other thing that I was thinking of in terms of that whole kind of like demon lover thing is, what do we think of when we think about Satan and queer desire now? And I'm thinking specifically, you know, Lil Nas X. Yeah, exactly.
And the same thing. I was like, this is so Call Me by Your Name. This is like, you know, thinking about that video and how much like panic Montero brought out. But that's because we've moved away from like just hypermasculinity to hypermasculinity being objectively the queer desire. Like this, like that probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for heavy metal in the 70s.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that it's always important to realize that, you know, the like queer narratives and I mean, for us, we're interested in Gothic queer narratives. They exist everywhere. So it's not just in heavy metal. But I do think that, like specifically in the 70s and the 80s, like people like Rob Halford, who today is like really vocal about, you know, his gay identity. I think it's really important to see the strides that they did, I guess, and the amazing work that they did with songs like A Touch of Evil, which is just such a great song. Yeah, I would, if you haven't listened to any Judas Priest before, I would go and listen to that song because it's great. Yeah, so that's basically little bit of Black Sabbath and a little bit of Judas Priest. And there's obviously like a lot more that's going on in the 60s and the 70s, but I just wanted to focus on those two because I think you can't talk about the beginnings of, you know, heavy metal, especially its Gothic beginnings, without Black Sabbath. And I also just think Judas Priest are just so fabulous and a really interesting kind of counterpart to that. But before we move on, I want to briefly talk about why is it called metal? So Great. Why is heavy metal called metal? So do you have any ideas for this?
So I don't know if this is true. I have always assumed that it was something to do with its like working class origins.
Yes.
Because so like where I'm from, like everyone was steel miners, and like my grandparents and stuff like were steel miners, and I've always assumed, particularly because like the Birmingham connections, because I didn't know from Birmingham, but I did. You can't not know that Ozzy's from Birmingham.
yeah.
Very vocal. Literally, it's in his voice. I always assumed that it's called heavy metal because it came out of that working class mining, steel working community, and I don't know if that is the case. But
you are absolutely on the money. So yeah, basically, like
Score one for inherited memory.
Absolutely, yeah. So in the 1970s, like there were a lot of metal bands, but also a lot of metal fans that were from like working class cities in the UK, and across the world as well, but specifically like the industrial north, and like Birmingham. So here, and as you said, there were iron and coal mines, there was smelting and forging and auto manufacturing. And so like metalworks in particular became a kind of like physical representation of the genre.
Yeah.
And it's also like a symbol of music, and the people railing against the wealthy elite. So did you know that Tony Iommi, so the guitarist from Black Sabbath, actually worked in a sheet metal factory?
I didn't, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah,
because that was pretty much the type of job that was available.
Exactly. And did you know that he actually had an accident in this sheet metal factory, where he lost the tops, like the tips of his middle and right fingers, on it, the middle and ring finger on his right hand.
I knew that he had like, I remember reading about him having had lost them. I did not know that was why.
Yeah, so he basically has this injury on his hands, as a result of working in a metal factory, and that absolutely like influenced the way that he played.
I was gonna say, that's what I remember, is it being like, you know, when you have to do like your like level 5 guitar exam. And it was like the origins of types of music, and I remember it saying like one of the reasons he played the way that he played is because he had that accident.
So one of the things for Black Sabbath was Tony Iommi would tune the guitar lower, which basically meant that it was easier for him to bend the strings, because of his injuries, but what that meant was you had like this
very deeper,
heavier sound. So yeah, it's a lot Tony Iommi, and his specific kind of playing sounds, but it's also just in general like the kind of like areas and the working class areas, and you see this as well in America, but specifically in the UK, like Birmingham is so important to like the creation of heavy metal. I just think that's really interesting.
Can I just say that I hope the people of Birmingham appreciate my respect that I have managed to get through this entire discussion without doing a bad impression of a Birmingham accent.
Here is your chance now, because we're going to move on.
I don't want people to get mad at me.
Okay.
Every fiber of my being wants to do it, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to be respectful this time.
I think that's very grown up of you.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm a mature adult.
And on that note, I guess, last chance. No. Okay, so on that chance then we're gonna move away from the kind of origins and look into some of its developments, which means that we're going to get into the 80s.
Yay!
Yeah. So what do you know about 80s metal?
I know that it's very performative, that you get bands like Thin Lizzy and Kiss, that there's like a very clear aesthetic, that there's lots of subgenres. I think of things like rock operas and like narratives and like characters as well. I think of I guess I think now as well I think of Thor Ragnarok because of that great use of Immigrant Song. I think when I think 80s, I think a lot of very performative, metatextual, big sounds, big hair. Lots of denim, lots of patches. That's what I think of when I think of 80s metal.
Amazing. Again, you're so on the money. Like I think you know a lot more about metal than maybe you think.
I think it's one of those things that I have absorbed by osmosis, like via osmosis. It wasn't my thing as a kid. Like I was much more into like, I liked punk and I liked grunge. Like I wasn't as into stuff, but I liked stuff like Rush and early Genesis, which has a very like the early Genesis, like I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe reminds me often of like the early Black Sabbath stuff, because there's that very haunting, weird, unsettling vocal to it. And even though the stuff I liked is more on the kind of either like punk into grunge or pop side of things, like Rush is very operatic and kind of melodic, it was still all running parallel to each other. And I think like I have absorbed as a teenager all of this knowledge and not really thought about it.
yeah And I always think that's really interesting about metal, because I think a lot of people think that metal is just like heavy stuff or solos or screaming, but actually like metal's really aware of everything else that's going on in the music scene in general. And sometimes that means that it's saying we don't like that, we're going to do something completely different. But other times it's like, oh, that thing's really interesting, I'm going to take this and work it into like my thing.
I'm not which is the other thing I'm thinking of, because I'm fairly sure you're going to talk about it later on. But yeah, when I also think metal, I think of a genre that appropriates and retools a lot of other genres, like rap and opera and like pop, like, and like particularly like electro and stuff like that. Like,
100%.
We'll leave that for like part 3.
So I guess that's a really good way, like thinking about that kind of appropriation, and how appropriation is always been important from its kind of origins and into its kind of developments. So the 80s saw like a lot of different subgenres of metal, so it's now an established thing, and people are trying to think, well, what kind of metal do I want to do? And because, you know, like all things Gothic, it just keeps snowballing and spawning new concepts and new trends.
Such a mutant. So,
in America, we see 2 kind of key trends, which are glam metal and thrash. And in Britain, what we see is what's known as the new wave of British metal. So we'll talk about that one first. And technically this new wave of British metal started in the mid 1970s with bands like Iron Maiden, Motorhead and Def Leppard. And like the original wave in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of the musicians and fans of the new wave were working class. And especially after Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party were elected in 1979, like a lot of these bands started to respond like to the kind of the rise of Thatcherism and social unrest in their songs. So rebellion against the elite was like a really important theme. But while the punk scene kind of encapsulated violent rebellion and sometimes anarchism, the new wave offered a kind of fun alternative of community, but also kind of escapist and fantasy themes. And that again is where we get a lot of kind of Gothic in that kind of escapism and those specific kind of, like you said, narratives and storytelling. Exactly.
Whereas punk at the time is very, it's just like, oh, I'm so angry about everything, and everything is, and I think, infuriating.
And I think there are some of like the big punk bands, I think when we look at them now, we can think, were you actually punk or were you just reactionary? So I'm thinking specifically of like the Sex Pistols and how some of them are kind of like, you know, pro-Trump now. And it's like, well, that's not very punk. You were just being a reactionary. But there are obviously like, you know, punk bands that are into that kind of anarchism and that kind of thing. But this is something a little bit different. And another key aspect of this is masculinity was really important, and so was male bonding. Now there were women in metal, both as fans and as musicians, and one of my favorite metal bands is actually Girl School, which is the longest running all-female rock band.
Amazing.
And Girl School had a long running collaboration with a really famous band in this wave, and I want to know, do you know who they collaborated with?
No.
So Girl School had a really long collaboration with Motorhead.
No way.
Yes. And they did a kind of little EP called Motorhead Girl School. Where they have a song called Running with the Devil. And they also sung each other's songs, and they went on tour together, which I just think is really great. And Girl School's like songs are also really, really good. But for the most part, a lot of these bands were
very masculine. And I think there's a strong argument for transness at this point because of how performative it is.
Oh yeah.
But it's a super like as a masculinity scholar, this is a period where you look at and it's like, yeah, this is very, and the hyper masculinity, as we said, often becomes very camp, but yeah, it's very male dominated at this point in time as a mainstream within the counterculture.
Yeah. So it's a way, like you could go to watch bands with your favorite men friends. Sorry, I was going to say with your favorite men, but you know, I mean, I guess that kind of works. But you know, or you could go.
How do men socialize?
I don't know. I'm not
me and a few of my favorite men friends. We go to the club and we watch a band.
But you could go to like music nights or festivals or other kinds of things and meet other men in a kind of homosocial way, not necessarily in a queer way, although you know, as we you know said with Judas Priest, there is always that kind of queer element and strand running through it.
This is kind of where like the mosh pit and stuff comes from as well. Like that's a very masculine homosocial thing that has developed this kind of like, you know, outlet of communal violence in a way that, like, you know, it has rules and you're supposed to look after each other, but it's you know, it's essentially Fight Club. You run around in a circle and kick the shit out of each other.
Yeah, and I have been adjacent to
mosh adjacent
a lot of mosh pits over the years. I actually really like them. It's one of my favorite things.
Stand to the side and watch the mosh pit.
Yeah, I like being that close because I feel like it's a nice way to feel like a kind of community. But yeah, exactly what you said, there are rules. And, you know, I always feel safe when I'm in a metal crowd because I know that if somebody falls over, I've seen it over and over again, people will stop the mosh and they will help people up. If somebody loses their glasses, people will try and find them on the floor. And if somebody feels, you know, uncomfortable or wants to leave, people will either, you know, whether it's via crowd surfing or by letting somebody out. So it is this kind of like, I guess consent's really important here. Like we're all consenting to this kind of what looks like a really violent thing. Where people are just running around, running into each other.
Healthy expression.
But it's a healthy outlet.
Like we joke, but that the idea of it is, but it, you know, it does come from this very masculine tradition of the 80s.
Yeah, 100%. So you have male bonding on the one side, and then on the other side you have all of these kind of stories about the occult and fantasy with links to science fiction and horror narratives. So again, that kind of, where are people getting their inspiration from? So obviously Black Sabbath drew on a lot of horror films and horror books, and so and that kind of keeps happening. So to focus on one band, then I want to talk about Iron Maiden.
Yay!
Who, you know, I mean, the name Iron Maiden is a very gothic name anyway. You know, it's a
my favorite thing about Iron Maidens is that they weren't real.
I know, but that's so gothic, isn't it?
And it's so gothic. This is my party fact. I'm always like, did you know that Iron Maidens never actually used this torture device? They're just like a folk tale. But then people did start making them because people started thinking about them, which as a name for a band just makes it even more gothic, because it's not actually, you know, they're not called like the Giblet or like an Oubliette. They're called Iron Maiden, which is a thing that, you know, is part of this mythology of the Inquisition that never actually existed, but then people did actually start making them.
Yeah, absolutely. I always love that too. I love the fact that it is based on a fake torture device. Yeah. But yeah, okay, so
that's a weird thing to get excited about.
It is, isn't it?
That's the question. Moving on.
Moving swiftly on. So, okay, Iron Maiden were formed in East London in 1975. But they're probably most well known for their lead singer Bruce Dickinson, who joined the band in 1981. And Iron Maiden's third album, The Number of the Beast, which was released in 1982, basically catapulted them into success and established them as pioneers of the new wave, but also one of the most important bands in metal of all time. So they recently, I mean, even now, they just had an album that came out, and they've been touring, and they're still going strong. But it's what happened in the 80s that really cemented that. And just as, I mean, the Number of the Beast has to date sold almost 20 million copies worldwide.
I feel like this is probably the first song that we're mentioning where people might go and listen to it thinking they've never heard it and realize they have.
Yeah.
I feel like you can't not have at some point heard this song. Like it permeates everywhere because of that refrain. Like, I'm not, again, also not going to attempt to sing it because I definitely can't.
Well, again, yeah, like Bruce Dickinson has really powerful vocals, and brings a kind of opera kind of esque style, which is really interesting. I think there are a lot of bands in metal where the vocalists have these powerful vocals, and it's like, listen, you know, am I at a metal gig or am I at an opera? You know, it's difficult to distinguish sometimes. But yeah, this album, so we're going to focus on this album for a little bit. It basically encapsulates all the themes and aesthetics and the musical tones that we can think about when we think about Iron Maiden. And it also, you know, shows how the band is Gothic. So you have heavy guitar harmonics, and a kind of galloping rhythmic style of guitar, and then you also have Bruce Dickinson's like just insane, you know, energy and vocals, and the themes of the songs in this album, but you know, this album is very kind of representative. They're inspired by literature, history, mythology, and also horror films. So the title track of the album, which is also called The Number of the Beast, was inspired by a nightmare that bassist Steve Harris had, and he had this nightmare after watching the second Omen film.
Oh, of course.
So yeah, so again, you have this kind of like the importance of watching horror films and consuming kind of like horror literature and horror narratives, but also the importance of dreams in that kind of creative process. So dreams as harbingers or as omens of supernatural narratives are really important. So again, if you want to pause here, go and listen to this song, or maybe link it somewhere. It's The Number of the Beast. You can go and do that and listen to Bruce Dickinson's beautiful vocals, and hear that, or you can stay here and I will read them to you. Do both. Yeah, okay. So yeah, just what I saw in my old dreams. Were they reflections of my warped mind staring back at me? Because in my dreams it's always there, the evil face that twists my mind and brings me to despair. Night was black, was no use holding back, because I just had to see, was someone watching me? In the mist, dark figures move and twist. Was all this for real or just some kind of hell? 666, the number of the beast, hell and fire was spawned to be released.
That's been like in the back of my mind the whole time, like that.
Yeah, that refrain.
That refrain is going.
It's very catchy. It gets in my head all the
So
time.
catchy. It gets stuck in your head. What's just occurred to me, I've just double checked the dates. I forgot that this is at the same time as War of the Worlds and the Alan Parsons Project doing Poe. So like you also have those two. So like I think so 76 is when they do the Alan Parsons Project, which is, if you guys are not familiar with, is this, it's one of my like things I always put it on at like our events and stuff because I love it. But it's a like rock opera version of Poe's short stories that I love. And then Jeffrey Wayne's War of the Worlds opera, which is amazing, is 1978. So there's this like big tradition all of a sudden for these like huge literature inspired, sci-fi horror inspired, like
absolutely narrative. It's very much go big or go home, like in terms of everything. The aesthetics, the set design, the story, the vocals, everything. It's go big or go home, frankly. But yeah, so I think with this song specifically, and also some of the other songs, you can see why the band has so often been accused of Satanism, which is again something that crops up a lot with heavy metal bands. And you know, in response to the album, there were public burnings of the album that were organized by religious groups, and I just think it's really interesting because if you listen to the song, you can see that Satan's the bad guy.
Yeah,
it's not pro Satan. But anyway, this track also features a spoken introduction, which quotes passages from the Book of Revelation. So again, you can see how it's inspired by the Omen. And interestingly, the band had hoped to get horror icon Vincent Price to read this passage, but his costs were too high, and he wanted to charge like 25k to read a bit. And so, do you want to know who they got instead?
Yes, they do.
So they got actor Barry Clayton, who is the narrator in the Count Duckula series.
Yes! Oh yes! My God! Mary, you know how I feel about Count Duckula. Count Duckula is my favourite Dracula adaptation.
It's so fabulous. I just love this. I just love it.
Count Duckula. Barry Clayton? I'm going to double check this. But oh my God, I love Count Duckula. That is fantastic. Oh, that is just so campus. Oh, amazing. That is just perfect. I love that. I'm very happy to know this.
On the one hand, I think it would have been amazing if they had got Vincent Price, and that would have been really good, like just in terms of like the crossover of like horror and metal. But actually I think I love that they have like Barry Clayton, because and again, go and listen to the introduction to the song, and it's creepy and it just works. It really sets that kind of like
I thought so. Barry Clayton was also the voiceover for The Weekend World, which was like a political, like very it was really dour, like it was on like I think it was on like London television or something, but yeah, it was a very like like a sort of like political, like The Weekend World, which is hilarious. But yeah, oh my God, Count Duckula, what an icon.
Exactly, what an icon.
Now I'm just imagining there needs to be a Count Duckula and Eddie Netflix cartoon.
We will get to Eddie in a little bit, but yeah, so other tracks on the album include Children of the Damned, which is a song based on the British sci-fi horror films Village of the Damned and then Children of the Damned, which were adaptations of John Wyndham's novel The Midwich Cuckoos, which has recently been adapted to a TV series on Sky.
Which is like, it's like a modern adaptation, isn't it? I'm tentatively excited about The Midwich Cuckoos.
But if you can't wait for it to come out, or if you don't have access to it yet, just go and listen to Iron Maiden's Children of the Damned, because that's inspired by the same source material.
Also, if you're an X-Men fan, this is where the name of the Emma Frost clones, the Stepford Cuckoos, they are named after the Stepford Wives and the Midwich Cuckoos.
Yeah.
Fun fact.
Very fun fact.
Fans.
So this album also featured artwork by Derek Riggs, with its cover depicting the band's mascot, Eddie. So Eddie in this picture is controlling Satan like a puppet, but Satan is also controlling a smaller version of Eddie, in a similar way. So you have this kind of who's controlling who, and this whole idea of very satanic and all of that kind of thing. But now, obviously, Lauren, you know who Eddie is, but some people might be thinking, wait, mascot Eddie?
Who the heck is Eddie?
What? So yeah, in the 80s, almost every other metal band had a mascot. Which is basically a figure that they use to encapsulate and represent their image, and it was also used on like their artwork and merchandise. So they'd have it on their kind of album covers, but then they'd also start selling like pins and t-shirts. You'd often
get these big patches that you could like pin or sew onto the
patches, big post, all that kind of stuff. And they'd also feature in their kind of live shows, so the kind of like the set pieces would heavily feature their kind of mascot.
They had like a late, I don't think in the 80s, but like in the 2000s, didn't they travel with that huge Eddie puppet?
Oh yeah. Like the kind of development of Eddie has been really, really interesting. Motorhead also had a kind of mascot or a logo.
Yeah.
So their logo is known as Snaggletooth. And it's basically designed to be a mix of human and animal skulls, which I think is just really interesting. For Iron Maiden's Eddie, also known as Eddie the Head, or just Ed, which reflects he basically started as a kind of papier-mâché mask, skull mask that they would call the Ed, which is where you get Eddie from. Probably the most well-known and successful of any kind of metal mascot. And there are loads, and over the course of this video, and then the part 2 and everything, we'll go into more mascots. But yeah, Eddie is the kind of the most well-known, I guess. He appears on pretty much most of their albums, and he also prominently stars in their live shows, as a massive kind of puppet, sort of big figure. So again,
very like lanky and spindly,
and he's very gothic, as a kind of gothic monster. So Eddie is continually resurrected and reincarnated, and he's appeared as a zombie, as an undertaker, as an Egyptian pharaoh, as a cyborg. At one point he's just got half a body, and there's just so many different there's so many different variations. There's even one where Eddie is standing over the corpse of a British Prime Minister.
There's so many to choose from. Did you know that you can get an Eddie Funko Pop?
Eddie's everywhere, and Eddie's great. So if you have any kind of favorite like Eddie incarnations, then do let us know in the comments, because I think Eddie is great, and the more Eddie that we can share, the better. But yeah, so that's Iron Maiden, a little snapshot just in a British new wave through one band and one album. But for now, what I want to do is kind of briefly take us across the pond to talk about some of the Gothic developments in American heavy metal.
Awesome.
So you mentioned Kiss a little bit ago, and so inspired by Kiss and also Alice Cooper, who were kind of like coming up in the 70s. In the 80s, glam metal saw massive mainstream success.
Yep.
And if you are thinking, what on earth is glam metal? Think catchy pop hooks.
It's exactly what it sounds like.
Catchy riffs and flashy, colourful, over-the-top glam aesthetics of big hair, face makeup, and tight clothes. Hence its alternative name, hair metal. So, think 80s workout video and big hair, or all the weird and wonderful trends in 80s fashion and big hair, or think like men on stage in full makeup, whether that be the kind of Kiss kind of face paint, or more kind of like drag inspired makeup. So we can think about bands like Quiet Riot, Motley Crue, and Twisted Sister. Love Twisted Sister. And a lot of glam metal songs also focus on women, romance, and sex. And there were also a lot of slow emotional ballads, so including one of my favorites, which is Cinderella's You Don't Know What You've Got Till It's Gone, which is just so over the top, emotional, and dramatic.
Well, it's kind of coming at the same time as like power ballad. So you've got
exactly
obviously people like Meatloaf that are kind of but even like like Celine Dion and like and Roxette, like, is coming at the same time, and I always think of like hair metal and glam metal being sort of the other side of the coin to bands like Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran, like on the pop scene, because they were also doing these very kind of like, it's all the like mist in the videos and lots of eyeliner, and like they're kind of, even though it's two very different sounds in a way, it's very much coming in on like the same spectrum, this very like produced, very aesthetic, very haunting in that kind of, I mean, that's why they call the New Romantics, because it is trying to re-embody Keats and Shelley and that kind of like gothic romantic style. And then glam metal is kind of doing the same thing, but on the camp, like Walpolian gothic side of it. That's like, it's almost like if Matthew Lewis was dropped into the 80s and was told to make a band, I feel like he would have been a glam rocker.
Oh yeah, totally. With the it's just so extra, like so extra. So yeah, that's obviously like glam metal, but you might be thinking, how is that Gothic? I mean, I think we have kind of talked about it a little bit with that kind of that excess, especially in relation to like the aesthetics, the theatricality, the campness, and the emotional resonance of its lyrics. But there's also a kind of revival of the occult as well. So the occult is everywhere, and these kinds of Gothic kind of hints to the satanic and all those kinds of things. So Motley Crue formed in Los Angeles 1981, and their second studio album is titled Shout at the Devil. And the band also incorporated occult symbolism, like the pentagram, into their live shows, which again led to cries of Satanism from Christian
satanic panic, peeps.
Yep. And the track Bastard was later targeted by Tipper Gore, wife of Al Gore, and the Parents Music Resource Center in their crusade against music they deemed to be disturbing and inappropriate for children. And this crusade led to the introduction of the explicit content warning on albums. So if you wonder why there's that little sticker on some of the albums that you see, it's because of Tipper Gore and this kind of crusade against musical artists, including heavy metal artists like Motley Crue, but also like Twisted Sister. And okay, so Dee Snider basically rejects that Twisted Sister is a glam metal band, but I think that we can consider them as one, or at least adjacent to one. So
look at them.
Well, this is the thing. So Twisted Sister formed in 1972, but they were obviously around for a long time, and especially in the 80s. And they're considered to be glam metal largely due to their use of makeup, and in particular Dee Snider's iconic look. So Dee Snider is great. I love him. And please go and Google, or maybe I'll put in an image here somewhere of his kind of like stage look, but it's fabulous. And he said that he actually prefers the term hid metal because he says that his band is hideous. So
well, his makeup was like consciously bad, wasn't it, compared to like Kiss or something like that.
So he said, I don't think Twisted Sister is glam because that implies glamour, and we're not glamorous. We should be called hid because we're hideous. And yeah, so throughout their song lyrics and theatrical performances and their hideous looks, they basically embrace and welcome the weird. And Snyder's actually kind of gone on recently to talk about the similarities between his look and drag queens. So you get that kind of that extra kind of gender performativity. And Dee Snider is a Christian, and he's in a heterosexual marriage. So for him, this is just a kind of like, gender performativity like drag. And he said, in relation to Drew Paul's drag race, that I think some of them definitely studied what I did in the 80s. And I think, again, like go and have a look at Dee Snider and Twisted Sister, because you can absolutely put up a picture of Twisted Sister and someone from RuPaul, and
like the big blue, he would be like the big blue eye makeup, and then it was like red, what I would think of as contour. Then like the big hair and stuff, and it is very drag, like in a positive way. Like it's not it's kind of like poking fun a little bit at the excess of the glam bands that were taking themselves very seriously, but the gender performativity always seemed very genuine and like a real kind of positive exploration and expression, rather than like like a camp satire in a good way.
I think again, like it's doing something very different to Judas Priest, but I think it's just showing how heavy metal does embrace everything from the weird to the queer, whatever kind of gender or sexuality or any kind of identity you have. There's always a place for you in metal, which I think you know, sometimes people either don't realize that about metal, or sometimes you do get fans that think that it's just very hyper masculine and that kind of thing. But these kinds of queer spaces have been not just present, but so important throughout heavy metal.
Yes. And that, I think maybe that's a conversation we have like at the end of part 3, but my experience of metal as a teenager was very much people taking it very seriously because they didn't fully understand the complexity and the history of it. And that's always the danger. And I think you get this with horror and Gothic as well, that it can come across straight in multiple senses of the word, like, and you don't get the subversion, you don't get all the stuff, and that then often will lead to a certain type of fandom.
But it's like Dracula, you know. I mean, Dracula, I think people look at and they're like, oh yeah, it's like this band of men being men with their men friends, you know, protecting women. And it's like, one, this is a very homosocial text. It's about male bonding and friendships, but also there is a queer undertone there. And there's also that kind of that idea of the other, and the idea that even before she's a vampire, Lucy says, I want all 3 men. And I think that's just really interesting, that you have these kinds of same things in horror texts, but also in heavy metal, where it may be on the surface they look, you know, really heteronormative, and that kind of, you know, straight-laced kind of way, but yeah, they're not.
Performativity, like, it's such an important aspect, particularly when it comes to Gothic, like what's being performed and how is it being performed, because once you get into performativity, it completely destabilizes everything, and everything becomes Gothic and everything becomes queer, to kind of like massively generalize it. But yeah, I think it's funny, isn't it? I wonder if we forget how performative and excessive and camp consciously heavy metal is as a kind of modern consumer, because we're looking backwards instead of being contemporaneous to it, and there's elements now of like cliche and things like that, and like stereotype, but yeah, hella performative. You don't get hair that big without like putting serious effort into it. Like, getting big hair is hard, man.
Oh yeah, big hair, and also like getting that consistent makeup look, like, you know, it's a lot of effort. But okay, I think on that queer weird note, we should round up for part 1. Obviously we're not done with the 80s. We haven't got to thrash yet.
We're never done with the 80s.
We're never done with the 80s. So our next part in this kind of exploration of the Gothic history of heavy metal, we'll pick up with thrash. So if you are really interested in why thrash metal is Gothic, then, you know, stay tuned.
Next time.
But I hope that, you know, looking at the Gothic origins and some of the kind of Gothic in the 80s, you are starting to get an appreciation for why heavy metal is Gothic.
And it's not, it's obvious, but it's not obvious all at the same time. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in or watching. Thank you, Mary, for this wonderfully well-researched piece as ever. We have been the Ghoul Guides. This has been the Ghoul Guide Association, and in the meantime, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.